Hey guys, Stockaholics, thanks for being here today. This weekend, I kind of went on a little deep dive, crazy rabbit hole investigation for, I don't know, probably 20 or 30 hours this weekend, if you can't tell based on the bags under my eyes. But I guess I wanted to kind of share some of the things that I've learned this weekend, some of the things that I've observed, and kind of maybe how some of those things play into a broad investment thesis. And I think I have a feeling that a lot of the things in this video are going to be maybe rambly and maybe incoherent, but I hope that it maybe turns into something coherent by the end. All right, so one of the things I looked at this weekend is the concept that technology is deflationary. So if you look at some of the high-flying technology stocks, a lot of people may be piling into them, perhaps because of this belief. They believe that technology is highly disruptive to society, and thus they are willing to pay higher valuations for those kinds of companies. They may also say things like technology grows exponentially. So for me to buy something that is disruptive to a sector, it is going to pay off significantly more in the long run, right? And to some extent, I agree. My philosophy, however, is that I like to buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they are expensive. And I believe quite firmly that the technology sector overall is still overvalued, even considering this kind of concept. But that doesn't mean that I necessarily disagree with this premise. I do believe that technology is deflationary. And there's all kinds of evidence that suggests this to be true. One of these recently is this company here called the Guitar Center. This company recently went bankrupt. You could say, well, maybe it was coronavirus that ultimately put the nail in the coffin for this company. I would suggest probably not. I think that it was probably some other things, yeah? And I guess I want to think about that a little bit in these kinds of questions down here. So first of all, why go to stores if you can order a guitar cheaper online, right? So for example, let's say a Guitar Center is an hour away from my house and I'm very interested in buying a new guitar. I could spend, 2 hours commuting there, looking at guitars, deciding if those prices make sense to me. Ultimately, maybe make a purchase, maybe not make a purchase. But what does that do? It's going to eat up a lot of my time, and time is a finite resource, right? So if instead I decided, maybe I don't want to go to the Guitar Center, maybe I'd like to use my time elsewhere, and I could instead compare prices online and probably find a better deal, cutting out the middleman that is the Guitar Center. Why would I even go to this place? I could just look on Amazon, for example, and buy a guitar there. In addition, maybe the Guitar Center has some services they provide. Maybe they'll go and if you went there, they would tune your guitar for you. Well, there's apps on my phone. There's technology apps that could do it for me. Or I could go on YouTube and learn how to do it myself. I don't need somebody at Guitar Center to provide this service to me. Maybe they have a course, maybe I could go to Guitar Center and take some lessons. But again, I'd have to go and commute there. Why would I do that when I could I could go on YouTube and learn how to play a guitar for free? So I think that ultimately, these kinds of things are happening, and I think that they're going to be happening more often. But there is kind of a problem that I'm noticing kind of in society, particularly from the Federal Reserve and from government, and that is this belief that labor needs to be supported. In my beliefs, if I was to work at Guitar Center, or if I was a manager at Guitar Center, or if I owned the Guitar Center and this company went bankrupt, does that suck? Absolutely. These people are going to have to find employment elsewhere. And ultimately, if let's say this place closes, that's going to increase the amount of available labor on the labor market. And, in theory, it could reduce wages, right? As there is more competition for people competing for the same kinds of jobs, right? However, I don't necessarily think that that is a bad thing. I think that if wages were to decline in society overall, that would actually be okay if we're thinking about the deflationary pressures that technology actually has. If I am only making, let's say I worked at Guitar Center, I was making $15 an hour. I got fired, and I had to go find another job somewhere else, and they were only paying $12 an hour. Well, let's say that my overall expenses, because of deflation, are lowering my expenses. Well, it doesn't really matter if that I'm getting a lower nominal dollar, because I can buy other things for cheaper, right? But what I'm noticing in society, especially as I've been going down these rabbit holes, is that the opposite has been happening, where we are elevating the prices of assets artificially, and those are in direct opposition to this concept that technology is deflationary. Now, another example here is this is a house that has literally been 3D printed. So there's been 3D printing technology, I believe is likely to continue to be disruptive in the future. And this house was literally made with a giant 3D printer. You see all of these layers on this house. There was a machine that poured each of these layers for whatever material this house was made of. And it went back and forth over and over and over until this house was literally printed from a giant machine, right? And if you think about that in terms of labor, let's say you're a construction worker and your job gets replaced by a machine that can literally do your carpentry work for you, can build your house for you. That's going to be extremely disruptive for a construction worker, right? You could literally be replaced by a machine, yeah? But on the other side of that coin, if you're thinking about this should actually make houses a lot cheaper, right? However, and this is a new technology, so would this be disruptive in the short term? Probably not. But if this kind of technology increases over time, absolutely, it should, in theory, be disruptive to the housing market. And there has been all kinds of innovations in construction besides this. This is just an extreme example, right? But what we're noticing is that asset prices are going up and up and up and up and up. And this is because of asset manipulation, yeah? And if you think about it, what if technology and construction is getting better and better over time, then why are housing and houses and all of these things going up and up and up and up? So I wanted to show you guys this. This is the effective federal funds interest rate. Now you can see in 2020, first of all, let me talk about that. In 2020, we've seen that the rate is effectively, I think, 0.25%. I personally believe the Fed is probably going to make that zero in a little while, but that's part of the bond thesis on why I'm invested in that. If you're interested in that, I would highly recommend checking out that bond video I made. I know it's not a popular topic, but I think that even if you're not interested in investing in bonds, I think that there is perhaps some stuff that you could learn overall. In any case, when we think about these, every time there is a recession, interest rates tend to drop. And now this is an effort by the Federal Reserve to stimulate the economy. Now, what I have argued and what I'm noticing is that I don't believe that this actually does benefit the economy. And let me explain why. So first of all, what you notice happens, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, is that it tends to push asset prices up. And if you think about that, it kind of makes sense, right? So banks during recessions, they want to loan to the most credit-worthy people. You know, the people who actually need these kinds of loans during recessions, the people that have been laid off from Guitar Center or wherever, those people don't tend to get access to the benefits of a lower interest rate. It's the people that are most credit-worthy. So notice how the interest rates are extremely low now. Well, the banks loaning the people that they're loaning to is very tight. So the people that have poorer credit, they don't tend to go out and they aren't able to get loans from the bank. Okay. Another thing that you can kind of notice from this is that every time interest rates go up, you can see that afterwards we end in some kind of a recessionary period. In 1955, they went up. There was a recession here. Same thing over here. Led to a recession a few years later. And we see interest rates go up. Recession shortly follows. Up over here in the 70s. Short spike during the recession, but ultimately came crashing down. And same thing in the 80s. Every time we see high movements in the interest rates, it, I believe, ultimately leads to a recession. So if we look recently, one of the things to kind of exemplify this is the 2000s. So as interest rates kind of went down over here, that made access to capital more interesting. And there's a theory that that actually led to the dot-com bubble. But more importantly is what happened after that. And we think in the 2008 crisis, 2009 crash to be related to housing. Well, you can see right before that there has been there was an increase in interest rates for houses, and simultaneously there was a freeing up of credit. But if these increasing interest rates ultimately do lead to a crash, I think that kind of explains the crash in 2008. Now, again, we've seen something similar in 16, 17, 18, 19, where interest rates were slowly increasing, but they had to go down as when these interest rates kept going up. There was the Federal Reserve noticed some cracks happening in the economy, so it had to reduce those rates. One other pattern to notice here is that over time, these interest rates have been steadily heading to a very firm support on the zero bound in interest rates. And we have been in this area before, and some of the insights, those times in the past, they were not good times. There was something called the Great Depression. And I think what ultimately could happen in the United States is something like we've seen in Europe, and which further emphasizes my thesis on bonds, and that we might actually see negative interest rates where the Federal Reserve tries to manipulate rates even more to the negative side. And what I think that is likely to do is that is likely to push assets up even more. It's not. I don't believe that it's going to stimulate the economy, because I believe banks are going to give loans to the most creditworthy people. Those creditworthy people realize there are people that already likely have money and that can pay these kinds of loans. And those kinds of people, what they're going to use these for is to buy assets. So what these things ultimately do, when you see these interest rates declining, and especially when you see simultaneous inflation. Now, I believe that we could be heading to deflation, especially if it turns into a depression. But when you see these decreasing interest rates, this benefits the rich, and it hurts the poor, because the poor don't have assets. They have cash. And so if they're holding this in a bank account, as over time goes on, or if they're buying a bond or whatever it is, and there's less and less interest on their savings account or whatever it is, they're losing wealth. But when these interest rates go down for the wealthy, it gives them more access to loans, and it gives them more access to purchase assets. And because they own those assets, which aren't depreciating in value, like the dollar has over most of its life, it gives them an extra advantage. And I believe that this is ultimately fueling the income inequality that has been growing both in the United States and in Europe. Now, to kind of visualize what I was kind of explaining is this. And I guess the main reason I'm bringing this up is kind of, if we're thinking about the American dream and what that is, for most people, that's owning a house, right? So you can see this blue line here. This is the median house price in nominal terms, but it's not accounting for inflation. So I think the more important thing to look at here is the inflation adjusted home price, this orange line from 1953 all the way until 2019. Now you can see for most of the time here that we were in this kind of range bound between 150,000 to about 200,000. However, that as time has gone on, we have been increasing these housing prices a lot. And if you're thinking about this in terms of the deflationary pressures of technology, does this actually make any sense? To me, I don't know. It doesn't. To me, it should make sense that we should be going the other direction. Housing should be getting cheaper. Why is it that the average price of a house is going up and up and up and up? Now you can see over here, there was that housing crash in 2008. Great time to buy a house, by the way. And that's something else to take away from this too, right? If we see that we're at these upper bounds over here, this isn't probably not, and this is an investment advice, this is probably not the time to be buying a house. Now, if interest rates go negative, could that push these asset prices even higher? Yes, absolutely. But to me, does it make sense to buy something high because it could go higher? Not really to me. To me, it makes sense to buy something cheap and then sell it when it's expensive, right? So we're stuck on a hamster wheel, especially if you're a wage earner, right? And you're stuck in between this rock and a hard place where you're being paid in an asset that is decreasing in value, while simultaneously the Federal Reserve is pushing up and up and up the prices of assets, right? So if you're stuck and you're broke, it's for the average person, it's very difficult to escape that kind of a trap, right? And a lot of people will argue, well, that's because of capitalism. But if you think about how the system works, the system we have isn't capitalism at all. It's socialism. It's redistribution of wealth, but in this case, it's redistribution from the poor to the rich, right? So I talked a little bit about asset manipulation, and this is in terms of the interest rates, right? In the last few slides. Some other concepts that kind of force a lot of people on this hamster wheel is taxation. Wage earners are the people who pay the most taxes. Because if you own a business or you own a corporation, a lot of the money that you earn from that, you can reinvest into other things. Or if you think about CEOs and people like that, of those nature, how are they compensated? A lot of times they're compensated in assets, so they're not actually taxed on them in terms of things like stock options, right? Now, I'm not in the camp that says we need to take money from the rich and give it to the poor. No, I'm in the camp that suggests that we need capitalism to solve the ills of society, not crony socialism, right? And one of the biggest problems I have is this concept right here, and it is wealth distribution. Now, I believe anytime that the government spends money, it's much more likely to be an inefficient way to do it compared to the private sector. Now, I made a very unpopular, very few people watched it on this, and where I talked about the Joe Biden and the Democrats and how to profit from that, right? And this is another thing too, where you're seeing this these social unrest in society, where you're seeing young people who are extremely interested in socialism and its glory and things like that, because they see this wealth divide, but they don't understand what is causing it. And it isn't capitalism. It's this system that we have that is socialistic in nature. We don't have, especially since 2008, we don't have the death part of capitalism. We haven't we've been bailing out all the things that we should be allowing to die in the destructive recreation, the destructive growth, destructive cycle of an economy. And there's another thing here where we're noticing there's age shifts. We're seeing older people, their population is becoming higher in relation to younger people. So I think that this first glance, this might not make a lot of sense, but I think that it's contributing a lot into the kinds of this situation we see here, because if you're older in nature, you're more likely to have assets. So if you have a higher population of older people compared to younger people, who, especially with these older people, tend to vote more often than younger people, they tend to be much more in favor of these policies that increase the value of their assets. Essentially, however, what it's doing is it's creating a permanent underclass, almost a slavery kind of a system, if you will. And if being an American, and a proud one, which I don't wish more people would say, I'm not very fond of that concept. All right, so I don't know, probably like a long rant here, but I guess what can we learn from all of this? This is an investment channel. What can you learn? And obviously, first of all, if you're looking at those housing prices, don't buy a house because you think it's going to go up in price, because as we saw in 2008, 2009, those things don't last forever. Buy assets when they're cheap. Duh, So buy things cheap, sell things high. Simple, I know. But the other thing is too, now recently I saw there was kind of these protests in DC where we have, on one side you have Antifa, people of those nature, leftists on one side. And then on the other side, you see these group of people who are Trump supporters. We could call them rightists or whatever you want to call them. Well, we're seeing a divide, and the divide is only increasing as this income inequality is growing. Now, for me, I love my fellow countrymen. I wouldn't want to cause them harm. I wouldn't want to do something like that. I'm very passionate about my beliefs, but fighting and living a destructive life like that in the United States isn't appealing. I don't want to do something like that. And and by the way, what happened in those protests, some people died. There's extreme violence. Several people got stabbed, and simultaneously you're seeing on the left these kinds of ideas where we should defund the police, and things of those nature. If we're heading into a depression, one of the last things that you want to be doing is defunding the police. But in any case, I guess what can you learn from all of this is to be flexible. I'm thinking about some of my ancestors, or at least the history of the United States. It's what drove these people to come here in the first place. It's the concept where they're seeking out a better life. You're looking for opportunity, and a lot of my ancestors did that for that very reason. They came here seeking a better life. And when I'm looking at all these things, and if I'm thinking, the United States is not going to be the place that I want, and despite the fact that I love this country very much, perhaps that I should keep in mind what my ancestors did and to seek out opportunity wherever that may be.